Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. A big way that we here at Good Faith and Redeeming Babel have been trying to help people make sense of the world is in the realm of politics. As many of you know, we have been running this big project on the After Party that's trying to help Christians make sense of politics in a Jesus-centered way. Then in the run-up to election, we had a number of special episodes, webinars, and then after the election, helping shepherd us in the aftermath of the election. And then if you've been listening to Good Faith, you will notice that the last 4 episodes have had very little to do with politics. We've been going through an Advent series on the 4 virtues of Advent and only making very sporadic reference to the political scene. That's by design. We felt like we needed a break. I certainly felt like I needed that. I've been noticing my own hunger for political news dropped off a cliff after the election. That laughter you hear is our guest, David French, as a preview. David, was that true for you? Actually, that can't be true for you. That's your job.
I don't have that luxury, Curtis. I don't have that luxury. I can't sit there and go, oh, well, I'm bored of politics now, but it's not bored of me. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I'm alone in that. I sense from a number of our listeners a sense of like, oh, needed a break. I needed a break. I've been noticing, my own news consumption. I get 2 main news sources. The Wall Street Journal as my sort of rightward leaning news source, and the New York Times as my somewhat left leaning source. And I don't think I've opened the New York Times app since the election. And I don't think
Curtis, do you not care about?
I mean, other than your stuff, David.
Okay,
other than, of course, that's a given. That's a given. I do that first thing of all of my regular practice, as we all should.
Of course.
The Wall Street Journal. I think I've scanned the headlines every day. I get the paper copy, and then I kind of toss it aside. I think that's been fine. And I think for many of us that has been the rhythm we've been in. I don't think that's sustainable either. So I wanted to ask the question as we head into the new year, and we're recording this on December 16th, just in case anything crazy happens in the news cycle. But as we head into the new year, I wanted to ask, is it time for us to be thoughtful about saying, okay, what does it mean now for how and what we pay attention to in the political realm? And I've already given away who my guest is for this conversation. It is, of course, our founding friend, David French, columnist at the New York Times, who pays all his bills and therefore forces him to pay attention to the news cycle.
Absolutely.
So, David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast. And I want to begin this conversation by asking you, do you sense that more broadly in the culture, in the American populace, there's been this lull, there's been this break, there's been this, I need a break from political news?
Well, I don't know about if that has been a widespread sentiment since the election. I do know it has been a widespread sentiment for a while. So if you look at, there's been a lot of sort of year over year, election cycle over election cycle analyses of trafficked websites and things like that. And even before the election, traffic was down to just a big chunk of political websites and had been for a long time. So like if you look at sort of American political interest, nothing has compared to 2020, like nothing. And so everything has been downhill since then, even though there have been some incredibly dramatic developments, from Ukraine to the Middle East to the 2024 election, which was incredibly dramatic with twist and turn, which all amounted up to basically the race stayed the same as it was. I mean, it was the most dramatic, non-changing political race I've seen, because you swap it out the candidates, you had these horrible assassination attempts, but the fundamental underlying electoral reality never really budged, which was wild. So I'm not so sure about the time. I mean, obviously there's a difference in traffic between election day and afterwards, but there's sort of a burst of interest in why did this happen, but there's overall been for a while a declining interest in political media.
Well, how do you make sense of that? Is that a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing? What is going on in terms of our appetite for political news?
I mean, let me put it this way. I think it is directionally, civilizationally a bad thing, but with some potential, with some caveats. So the reality is that only a small minority of Americans pay close attention to politics, period. Right.
Hmm.
And only a small amount in percentage of Americans really participate in the political process much.
Yeah.
So if you had 17 million people voted for Donald Trump in the primaries, and 75, 76 million, according to the latest vote counts, voted for Trump in the general election, and 14 million voted for Biden in the primaries, and then 74, 75 million voted for Harris in the general. What that tells you is we have two very different populations. We have the politically interested population and everybody else. And one of the things that's distorting our politics is that the everybody else segment doesn't pay attention to politics.
Yeah.
And so the problem with that is they are constantly sort of parachuting into the political process every 2 to 4 years. They're voting against the backdrop of a remarkable amount of ignorance. And I'm not insulting people to say this. It's just a fact. I mean, it's just a fact. And so they're voting on the basis of with a remarkable amount of political ignorance, casting their vote and then stepping back out again, and then leaving that 17 million on the GOP side, 14 million or whatever on the Democratic side. They're still in, they're still engaged. And so they end up arguing with each other about why the giant bulk of people did what they did. In the meantime, that giant bulk of people's gone on and doing their own thing. They're not even aware that the argument is taking place. And, I will tell this to people because basically everyone who listens to this podcast is probably a pretty politically interested person, at least we're culturally engaged. And I talk, to people about this, people who come to my speeches and talks. And if you're coming to hear me speak, you're self-selecting as a part of a pretty small slice of America relative to the whole. And so what's ending up happening, Curtis, is just giant chunks of people are parachuting into the political process, voting against a backdrop of a giant amount of ignorance, moving back out of the political process. And that is not good. Now, where I add the caveats is there are very bad ways for people to get engaged in political discourse. So I'm hesitant to say just get involved constructively, but it's just a fact that a giant distortion effect is the fact that most Americans who vote in general elections pay very little attention to what's going on.
Yeah, it's almost like you think of this as diet. And you want a nice, steady, good, healthy diet,
Right.
not binging,
Right.
and sort of like gorging yourself and then, completely abstaining and then gorging and then abstaining. And that's a little bit of what we've got in terms of our diet of news consumption. So I wanted to ask you to kind of model for us what a healthy diet of news could look like for us in 2025. And I thought I would do that, David, by asking you to model that for us. And maybe a lot of our listeners are already doing that, but maybe some of our listeners also really actually they are hungry. They are themselves needing like, hey, I need to reset my political news diet consumption into more healthy ways in 2025. And this is a way for us to help you do that. Or you have friends, family members, colleagues, and so forth that are in that group of completely disengaged, not following. And this could be a way that you help them, encourage them, maybe give them a little guidance to, hey, these are some issues you should pay attention to. So let's do that, David. And I did that by asking you like pick 5 topics that you think most people should at least be somewhat educated about, somewhat following, in 2025. Now, of course, obviously, we can't predict the future, so there will be things that will come up
sure.
that you just can't predict. But what are some like where we stand right now here at the end of 2024 that you predict? These are big issues that anybody who is going to be voting, anybody who's going to be talking about politics, anybody who is going to try to in some way be an educated citizen of this country, you should be following, you should be knowing something about. So let's start the five with a countdown, reverse countdown. Let's start with number 5 on your list, David. What would be that topic?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. But first, let me just say, when it comes to moderate consumption of news, I'm not a model for anybody.
Right. No, that's right. I'm asking you for the topical selection.
Okay. Gotcha.
David is the most voracious consumer of news in my life that I know. But so that's right. Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of hard to put these in sort of an order of importance. So with the caveat that when you hear me say this number 5, some people are going to jump through their iPhone saying, this is not number 5, this is number 1. Okay. I'm just going to punt the proportionate part of this, what's the most important. And to me, this is top 5. And my number 5 was January 6 pardons. And so the reason why that is one of my top 5 issues is that the January 6th attack on the Capitol was one of, that will go down in history as one of the more destructive and dramatic events in the history of American democracy, where there's an actual violent attack to try to overthrow the results of election. And then Trump has won, and he's pledged to pardon some or all of these individuals. And so the reason why I put that as a number 5 or in the top 5 is this really does go to sort of the heart of the rule of law in our democracy, and how much is our democracy going to become a kind of might makes right environment where that is exactly the opposite of what the founding fathers wanted. And one of the ways that you create a might makes right society is by abusing the powers that have been given to you. And the pardon power is kind of Curtis, it's interesting. If there's one prism to read the Constitution, and that prism is read the Constitution as a sustained attack on royal privilege. It's, so essentially the 1787 Constitution is, we're not Great Britain. We don't want to be Great Britain. We do not want a monarchy. We don't want vestiges of a monarchy, but they did not eliminate all vestiges of monarchy. One of the last remaining elements was the pardon power. And in fact, in the ratification debates, there was a lot of debate about this pardon power because people accurately saw that it was subject to abuse. And during the ratification debates in Virginia, and particularly, it came up, and the argument was, wait, if someone abuses their pardon power, impeachment is a remedy.
Yeah.
Well, we now know impeachment is sort of a dead letter. I mean, it's very few. Mitt Romney was the first person in American history first senator in American history to cross the aisle to vote to impeach a president in their own party. So impeachment is, as of right now, kind of a dead letter, which means that the pardon power is fundamentally unchecked. And we're about to see, and Biden, by the way, has shown us how powerful that is and how it can be abused. And Trump may take it, say, hold my beer. And if that's the case, what you really are looking at is a might makes right approach.
Yeah.
And I think that is very dangerous. And so that's one of my top 5 arenas for engagement.
David, that issue also seems to illuminate this key feature of American politics, which is, I think, that how much character ultimately is at the bedrock of a sustainable republic. We'd like to, talk about how our checks and balances are going to protect us, how strong our institutions are. But so many of these institutional practices, at the end of the day, it seems like they still depend on us electing leaders of high character who will adhere to the norms that reflect the kind of character of a country and of leaders we want. And so the pardon seems to be an example of that, because, like you said, the supposed institutional check of impeachment isn't going to hold the line. We really are dependent on our leaders actually using this in wise, virtuous ways.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think that we're learning, the last 9, now moving to 10 years, has been for those who are paying close attention, has been a giant civics lesson. And one aspect of the civics lesson is that even though the founders tried to control for various forms of common human failing, Federalist 51, if men were angels, or no need for government, so they were trying to control for the ways in which powerful people consistently become corrupt. But they couldn't do it for all. They could not create a system so airtight that it was corruption proof. And this is one of the reasons why John Adams said in a letter to a Massachusetts militia that the Constitution, in essence, couldn't thrive in the face of relentless human vice. So, Constitution was made for a moral and religious people, wholly inadequate for the governance of any another. And he says that, there are certain vices, that will go through the cords of our Constitution like a whale going through a net.
Wow.
That's some tremendous imagery. And he's exactly right. And so we are learning that America is built on the honor system in a real way.
Yeah.
And it's an honor system not just on integrity in sort of, am I going to voluntarily limit myself and govern my action according to specific moral norms? There's also this way in which I don't think we realized how vulnerable an American population was to individuals who have zero, and I mean zero regard for the truth, because the American people are not that informed, Curtis. They're just not. And so if you are going to exploit that ignorance, what we're learning is you can actually go quite far.
It seems to me then that the call for us, especially as followers of Jesus, is to still maintain the honor system, like you said, still honor the virtues, honor the truth, honor, honor the character traits that we believe should be in place in our leader, even when it's not. And so that's the really hard thing, right? Because when we see our leaders violate the honor system that we believe should be in place, it's very tempting to just start shrugging and like, well, I guess that's the way it is. And to actually ourselves sort of accommodate to this degradation of the virtues in place.
Well, you raised something interesting, Curtis, because I don't know if you've had this experience, but a number of people have said to me and around here, they're like, David, does it feel as if people are meaner? Does it feel as if there's sort of a sharper edge in the air? And I have absolutely felt that. Like I have had people unsolicited to me say that they feel that. And I think one of the things that we're realizing is that if people are transgressive and successful, that eliminates for a number of people a kind of moral barrier against their worst conduct. Not a moral barrier, a consequential barrier.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people choose to conform to moral norms, not necessarily because they have a moral conviction that that's the right norm, but because if they transgress it, there's a cost, there's a consequence. And so if you don't have that strong fundamental moral foundation and you see people transgressing and prospering, virtue can feel like a sucker's game, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that one of the things that's happened is that virtue is now perceived in many ways as a sucker's game.
Yeah.
And so and this is why, for example, healthy forms of moral sanction in society are indispensable because they maintain consequences for moral transgression. And there's a couple of ways, I think, where these sanctions, these healthy sanctions, dissipate. One is if there's excessive zeal in their imposition. So cancel culture, et cetera, where you're morally policing in a zealously fundamentalist and puritanical way, makes people want to cast aside restraint. And the other thing is when someone casts aside restraint and they prosper and they succeed, that seems like the sucker's game to be virtuous. And so, a lot of people, I think a lot of virtuous people are feeling like Ned Stark right now. Like I've tried to do the right thing and now I might lose my head for it. And it, metaphorically, and it
Game of Thrones reference for everybody who is not
exactly
following that. Yeah.
And so, when virtue starts to appeal like a fool's errand is when you know that a culture or society is beginning is beginning a slide.
The Judeo-Christian narrative is built for this. Like just go to the Psalms, go to the Proverbs. How many of those verses are precisely addressing this sense that virtue is a sucker's game, and what do you do about that? How many proverbs and psalms are about like, why do the wicked prosper, and the envy of the wicked that are prospering despite all any expectation that
Right.
that should not be the case. And so I think this might be a good season where with one eye we're reading news accounts where it does seem like the wicked are prospering, and with our other eye, to use Karl Barth's analogy, we have to hold the Bible. We have to read two texts side by side, because the text of the newspaper may be telling us, yes, the wicked are prospering, at least in some of the headlines, like getting pardoned for participating in an insurrection. And the other eye then therefore has to be on those passages of Psalms and Proverbs that are addressing that lament, that complaint of why are the wicked prospering. We're going to need to read both of those texts side by side. Okay, David, that was number 5. Tee up number 4 for us.
Yeah. So number 4 for me is, what is RFK Jr. confirmed? Okay. So that's number 4 for me. And in many ways, so if I had to identify the 3 nominees I'm most concerned about, they would be in order: RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth, and Tulsi Gabbard. Now, why would I be more concerned about RFK Jr. than Hegseth or Gabbard? I think that there are a lot of institutional restraints in the Department of Defense and in the American intelligence agencies that it is for good and ill. Let me put it this way, Curtis. For good and ill, it is hard to change course in those institutions. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that a Pete Hegseth or a Tulsi Gabbard can come in and try to be a wrecking ball, it's a lot harder than you might think. And notice I said for good and ill. In this circumstance with, say, Hegseth or Gabbard, I think in many ways the underlying sort of momentum of these vast bureaucracies is for good, because I think they will be malign influences. But for ill also happens when you have entrenched interest and entrenched bureaucracies that are resistant to positive change. And I do think that there is a scenario where a different president with different nominees would come in and be able to, and I include this with the DOJ and Kash Patel with FBI, that I do think there are circumstances where a different president with different nominees would nominate people who have positive influence that then would be resisted in a negative way. But in this circumstance, I think it's sort of the reverse.
Inertia is our friend here.
Inertia is that's it. You just made my word salad make sense, Curtis. Inertia. But here's the thing with RFK. It isn't just it. I do think HHS has a lot of inertia, again, for good or ill. But here's the issue with RFK: the bully pulpit. And here's what really worries me about RFK is you put him in HHS, you surround him with that MAGA entertainment media complex, and he's going to have a giant bully pulpit for absolute quackery medically. Yeah. And this is going to have real consequence. We're already seeing people increasing the rate of refusal of childhood vaccines. We saw what happened, in Samoa when RFK got involved in the vaccine debate there, and dozens of people died from a measles outbreak, just awful stuff. So in many ways, I think the danger of RFK is how he can go over and above the bureaucracy and straight to the American people, right, and continue to foster doubts in some of the most life-saving and valuable public health measures we've ever undertaken in the history of humanity, Curtis. And so that is concerning to me.
Right, because the Department of Defense and the Intelligence Department, they don't really affect the daily health practices of millions of Americans. Right. HHS does. And so this is sort of why.
And even if Kash Patel decided tomorrow, I'm going after David French, or, my Advisory Opinions co-host, Sarah Isger, she's actually on Kash Patel's list. So if he decides tomorrow, I'm going after Sarah or I'm going after David, we have a lot of due process protections. We have a lot of ways to check that. If RFK undermines vaccine uptake using his bully pulpit, I mean, the knock-on effects of that in people's lives could be just catastrophic and systemically dangerous.
And David, in those cases, what might be an average listener What would be your advice? Like, how can you be, at least in your little corner of the world, be a helpful counter to that kind of misinformation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is, do you want to get involved with your senator and remind them of their obligations under Federalist Number 76, which, again, it's the Republican senators who are the main concern here, and remind them of their obligations under Federalist Number 76, that they are not supposed to just give the president the team he wants. Why have advice and consent if that's,
Yeah.
but they're a check on the president's favoritism, and they're a check on the president's desire to often nominate unfit characters. So you can obviously engage with your senator, but there's another bigger thing, which is engaging with friends and neighbors in a very kind but firm way about just continuing to tell the truth about things as basic as childhood vaccines. I talked about, right after the election, I wrote a piece where I said, hey, I look at my obligations going forward in many ways as kind of twofold. One is protect the vulnerable, and the other
Yeah.
one is speak the truth. And this is an area where speaking the truth is just incredibly important, because the disinformation, the misinformation surrounding childhood vaccines is just metastasizing.
Yeah, it's going to be important, I think, especially for Christian medical professionals, Christian scientists, to really step into the fray and counter the misinformation. We've been talking about how many of us have felt like, we've needed a break from paying attention to the headlines from political news. And how then in 2025 do we re-engage in especially the ways that are most important, most necessary? And David's been taking us through his top 5 lists of at least at this point in this mid-December of 2024, what are the topics he thinks we should be paying attention to? We've talked about what happens with January 6 pardons. We've talked about especially the nomination of RFK and how he might be misusing that bully pulpit. All right, David, that's 5 and 4. What's number 3 on your list?
Yeah, number 3 on my list is, what, if anything, is Donald Trump going to do on the abortion issue?
Mm,
So why would I raise this after Dobbs, after the pro-life movement has by and large been an electoral retreat, with a couple of exceptions, one big with Florida, which did not pass a pro-choice amendment, kept its heartbeat bill in place by the skin of its teeth. The pro-choice amendment needed 60% of the vote. I think it got around 57%. But the pro-life movement has been in real retreat. But that has not stopped a big chunk of evangelical America to continue to browbeat people and say, you're not a Christian if you don't vote for Donald Trump, or there's no way Christians can vote for Donald Trump. But the Republican platform is functionally pro-choice now. So
yeah.
I'm very curious to see whether there is any sort of concrete, meaningful pro-life action. And I'm not talking about some small regulatory thing way down deep in the federal bureaucracy. I'm talking about something meaningful that moves the needle. What are we going to see? And the only thing that I can think of where anything from a pro-life perspective positive is on the horizon is if he continues past practice on judicial nominations. That would be it. Other than that, I feel like we're going to be looking at an administration that is going to do, the way it's going to behave is going to be functionally not very different at all from a Democratic administration on that issue. And if that is the case, I think what you're going to see is a real challenge sort of put forward to the evangelical community. What is it exactly
Yeah.
that is making you draw the hard line here for the Republicans? Let's get real specific about this, because it's starting to feel like this is just cultural and tribal and not ideological and principled. And
Yeah.
so I think that's going to be very important, because if the Republican Party abandons that, sort of more permanently abandons that pro-life identity, I understand why they do it from an electoral standpoint. But then from the other hand, wait a minute, what then is your argument, evangelical church? Because it
Yeah.
can't all rest on trans athletes. Like, that's not very many people, guys, and that's way downstream for most people's lives. So what is it? What is it? And so I think that will be very important.
David, what would that conversation sound like? Like, put yourself in the situation of uh, let's even say a daughter, an adult daughter and their parents. Let's just say, I don't know how many conversations I've had this where the person of the daughter generation, my generation, in our network, in our audience, I never, voted against Trump, doesn't believe in what Trump stands for. The parent uh, voted for Trump, and the main rationalization, like you said, has been abortion.
Always.
And that it's always, that's the go-to
Mhm.
move, right? So advise that daughter, like, let's say the conversation about politics comes up. How do you conduct that conversation in the light of everything you just said, where that rationalization has been stripped away? Do you go for it? Do you really sort of point out the hypocrisy involved in this rationalization?
Yeah, so here's number one. I would bet money that the parents in this scenario do not even know that the
Mm,
Republican platform has changed. So again, remember, there is so much political ignorance in this
right.
country right now. I
Yeah.
talk to people, I am not making this up, Curtis. I talked to people who did not know Donald Trump had been convicted in a New York court, like had no clue of that. Like, and so again, your listeners are saying, what? No. Yes. Yes. I mean, we're living in a country where at one point more people knew that Randy Jackson was a judge in American Idol than knew that John Roberts was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I mean, let's just get real here. So,
Yeah.
step one, do they even know?
Right.
Okay. Step two, will they believe you if you tell them?
Mm,
Okay, now so those are two different. So here's number one: do they even know? Number two: will they believe you if you tell them? Because here's the wild thing, Curtis. Even as Trump was running away from the pro-life position, a lot of MAGA was still out there making the pro that your
yeah.
vote for him
Oh, it's
because
still out there. It's
it's
still,
all
yeah.
out there, right?
Yeah.
And so number two, will they believe you? Is do they know? Number two, will they believe you? And so, and that's a circumstance where I think actually this is a sign of how big changes take a long time to kind of percolate through the system.
Yeah.
And so I do think that's why I'm looking at the next 4 years. So if the next 4 years there isn't any real concrete pro-life action, and then the Republican Party sort of sticks with the same platform in 2028, which I suspect it will because it won in 2024, then, it's going to be very interesting to see how you then make the Christians can't vote for Democrats argument. Now, because there will be other factors. Trump's not going to lift a finger to do anything to overturn Obergefell or gay marriage. Not a finger. Okay.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you're going to be standing there and people are going to tell you, in my experience, is one of two things. Like the last lines of defense are the trans issues and the border. Well, I'm sorry, the border is not as scripturally salient
Yeah.
as abortion. Like what does the Bible say about the number of people who can cross the Rio Grande? Like that's very debatable, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think that you're beginning to see Christians moving to these other issues that are different from the line in the sand issues that created that union between the Republican Party and the evangelical right. And so I'm just very curious as to see how that's going to
Well, and
go.
let's be honest. I think most of us, like you and me, who have been engaged in the world of American evangelicalism, like actually believe, at heart, what's going on is not a principled, scripturally based motivation in the vast majority of people for voting for Trump. There's something more tribal, like you said, something more
Oh,
visceral about
well,
loss of power,
even
loss of privilege. Yeah.
even going back to 2016, Ryan Burge ran some of these, statistical analyses and found out that evangelicals really voted for Trump for immigration restrictions more than over abortion. So
Yeah.
even going back to 2016, and so my experience was what was really getting people out of bed in the morning to just charge the barricades for Trump was the wall. But then what they would use abortion for is to try to suppress evangelical dissent.
So, like, give a quick primer here, David. What would be three facts or three pieces of information that you would say, look, this is undisputable. It's true. This is evidence that Trump and the Republican Party have abandoned the traditional pro-life cause. What would you
Well,
point to?
well, number one is the Republican Party platform changed.
Mhm.
from, for example, supporting a human life amendment and to essentially just saying this is up to the states. Whatever the states decide is fine. Which is not a pro-life argument. It's a pro-choice argument. Whatever, it's just putting the choice in the voters' hands and the states' hands. And if the voters or the states choose to give the choice to women, then the GOP has nothing to say about that. So number one is you have a pro-choice platform. The second thing is you have Trump very plainly saying he doesn't want to do anything to restrict access to abortion pills. So this is a big part of if you had the pro-life movement had sort of a legal agenda, it would be pass laws where you can to restrict, abortion rights, whether it's a 15-week ban in one state, a heartbeat bill in another state, just whatever is the most pro-life law that you can pass. But at the same time, at the federal level, there was litigation that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court about whether the FDA properly approved the abortion pills. And so for Trump to say, no, we're not going to do anything about that, that's a big, big part of sort of the pro-life legal effort. And so those two things right there by themselves. And then the last thing that I would say is then you just have a lot of Trump rhetoric where he, for example, called the Florida abortion law, the heartbeat bill that barely survived in 2024. He called it, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like dumb or ridiculous or too much, too far, or whatever. So there's no sort of bully pulpit help. There's no formal legal help. And to the extent that there is going to be a legal effort to try to restrict access to abortion pills, it looks like Trump will be on the other side of that. So those are three quite big things that are just very different from previous Republican presidents.
All right, David. So we've covered January 6th pardons, the RFK nomination, the fact that Trump has abandoned the pro-life plank. What is number two on its sort of a macro topic you think we should be paying attention
Are
to?
mass deportations really coming, Curtis?
Yes, I agree with you. I would put that number one, but let's talk about that one.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's interesting because this is one of those areas where the rhetoric has really outstripped reality. And I think there's just a lot of Americans, again, let's remember we've got a lot of civic ignorance, and some of that civic ignorance has been intentionally exploited. There's a lot of Americans who think that we've always had this ability to just get all the illegal immigrants out of this country, and all the presidents in the establishment, including Trump in 2017 to 2021, just didn't get it done. Yeah. And they're mad, they're angry. But the reality is it's just unbelievably more complicated than that and more difficult. Yeah. And so to the point that if you tried true mass deportations, the disruption to American society would be something that would shock you. It would really shock you. Moving millions of people from one place to another is not something that is easily accomplished, and it's definitely not easily accomplished when the movement is involuntary, and that has always been accompanied by an immense amount of human suffering when you have involuntary movements of millions of people. I don't even think it's feasible, Curtis. And then the other thing is, a lot of what are called illegal immigrants are actually asylum seekers. And so they haven't had their case adjudicated yet. And so it's not actually the case that they're here unlawfully. They have been allowed to be in this country while their asylum application is pending. So this comes to everything from what do you do with natural born citizens of illegal immigrant parents? Are you deporting them too? Is he going to try to strip birthright citizenship? Are we going to see sweeps through communities? Or what are we going to see here? And this is also an area where resistance to his mass deportations could cause him to trigger the Insurrection Act. This is a very dangerous thing because his promises, in many ways, vastly outstrip his capacity. And if he tries to ramp up capacity to meet the promises, keep the promises, then he's going to disrupt American society at a level that most people don't quite understand.
Yeah, I think people need to realize just the level of pain and suffering that will through our country
Oh
if
man.
any, even a portion of his rhetoric comes into being. The you're talking about taking parents away from young kids. I mean, if the previous administration, his previous attempt is any indicator, there's some very harsh draconian. You're talking about images of kids in cages. That was part of that first move. You're talking about disruption to the economy and to businesses that depend on labor from undocumented immigrants and so forth. It's going to be massive if this is going to actually happen. David, I want to talk a little bit. I mean, this is a topic that I think we need to spend more time talking about in 2025, especially depending on what actually happens. But I want to start with this one, which is let's just start with the basic information, sort of benchmark we talked about. What would you say are some of the things that most people just don't understand? They just don't get right. I mean, you mentioned that a lot of the people that are being thrown into the illegal camp, in the illegal category, are not actually illegals. They're simply just waiting for their case to be adjudicated. What are some other things that are just like basics? You just need to know this in order to have the
Oh,
proper sense
nothing
making.
compared to the asylum issue.
Yeah.
Like the asylum issue is the 800-pound gorilla of the immigration debate. And
So say more, expand
yeah,
on that a little more.
so
Yeah.
essentially the way it works is that under international law, let's back up. So after World War II and the failure of so many of the liberal democracies to take in Jewish refugees during the rise of Nazism and during World War II, there was a lot of international shame. And so one of the elements of kind of the whole never again concept is, free societies should offer refuge to people fleeing persecution and violence. And that happens in the American system through sort of two avenues. One is refugee resettlement, and the other one is asylum. They're different things. So refugee resettlement is a sort of a formal process through which individuals go through nonprofits, other kinds of NGOs to become a person who is eligible for refugee resettlement. It's very orderly, it's very deliberate, and it doesn't involve a huge number of people. The other part is asylum. And asylum is if you don't go through, you're fleeing, like you might be fleeing violence, you might be fleeing political persecution. You don't have time for this refugee resettlement process. You are hightailing it out somewhere because you have no time, no capacity, no ability to go through this process. So you land in America and you say, I want asylum. And asylum law says there are specific grounds for granting asylum, political violence, religious persecution, etc. And so you walk in and you say, I want asylum. And at that point, the law says, and we're supposed to be detained while your asylum petition is pending. Well, unfortunately, Congress, in its infinite capacity for incompetence, enacted a law requiring detention, but then did not fund detention facilities. So it's literally impossible, Curtis, to detain asylum seekers. And so what we've done is we've released them into the interior of the country, given them court dates. Well, then we also underfunded the system so that the backup and the backlog is unbelievable, Curtis, on the asylum system. So if you want to talk, and then this becomes a giant magnet. So, there's a lot of tough conditions in South America. And so people will come and they know that even if their asylum claim might get rejected, they still get to stay in America while it's pending. And so we have not fixed this yet.
Yeah.
And so until we fix this, it's just going to be a mess. I don't care what Trump does. It's going to be an absolute ever-loving mess. And so there was a bipartisan compromise bill that not only would have limited the numbers of people who can enter the country in any given month, it also dramatically beefed up the asylum system so that we could more quickly and rapidly adjudicate these claims. And Trump had it killed. He had it killed. And so here we are with a situation where asylum is still broken and it's still the case. And so we have to have a certain kind of asylum system, but the current one that we have is understaffed, underfunded, it's broken, it's terrible. And so this is the flashpoint. This is where our immigration system is going to be fixed or not fixed. It's in asylum.
Yeah, this is a global problem with a global flow of refugees because of so much of the disruption and pain and suffering that's present in the world right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so if we want to be a decent country, we need to allow for asylum. We need to allow for refugees. Now, at the same time, even as wealthy and as powerful and as many resources as we have, we cannot accommodate the kind of flood that we saw come in. So we also need reasonable restrictions and alternatives and things like this. So that's why you have things like a legislative compromise. And
Yeah.
instead, what we've got coming in is a situation where it appears that Donald Trump's going to try to walk in and just through on his own authority with his own power unleash upon the the what
Yeah.
he would might call the illegal immigrant population, but is often illegal immigrants, yes, but many of them are asylum applicants, which are they illegal in that circumstance? Well, not while their application is pending.
Yeah.
And so this is a situation where longer term constructive changes that were consistent with America's legal and moral responsibilities, but also consistent with understanding our own limitations and resources and ability to absorb people, we had a sensible compromise. And for short term political gain, it was torpedoed. And now we might have an extremely disruptive, extremely cruel
Yeah.
response instead. And that's why it's a top 5 area for me for people to engage.
Well, and it's something that it's an example of how it is so hard to have a narrative that is understandable by a population that is not paying attention and doesn't understand the truth of things, to have a narrative that actually is more truthful. Because the truth is, if you look at all the studies, all the reputable studies, economic studies, of the impact of immigration on America, it is a net positive. Now, of course, it's not a blanket positive. There are there are disruptive effects, there are costs involved and so forth, but everything that you study in terms of the net positive effect is America. Like, immigrants are a economic and social engine for America in so many ways, especially in some of these in some of these very like red communities that are actually experiencing population decline. It is flow of immigrants. And you go to Tulsa. Like, Tulsa is an example of where a city that has actually, in a very kind of a local way, fostered a city that welcomes immigrants, and it's been an economic engine in a city that otherwise could be experiencing real decline, because David, as you've talked about, like, we are experiencing like declining birth rates where we are experiencing,
Yeah.
and that's really severe in some parts of the country, because you have, in addition to that, you have also out migration because of people finding better economic prospects elsewhere, and in many of these communities, it's an immigrant population that is kind of like driving some sense of economic revival or prosperity and so forth. And so that's a really hard story to tell. It's much easier to tell the story of quote unquote rapists and murderers crossing the borders in droves, which is not actually the
No.
true story.
No, tons of misinformation out there about the number of murderers and sex offender. I mean, some of the stuff running up to the election was just embarrassingly false that people were
The
spreading.
Haitian immigrant
Yeah.
story in
Yeah.
Ohio.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
All right, David, we're down to number 1. What is the story that you think should be right near the top, or if not at the top, of what should be occupying our attention?
Yeah, so that's this is coming, Curtis, Ukraine, and
Yeah.
this is the one between Ukraine and the possibility of true attempts at mass deportations. To me, those are the top 2. All not to denigrate the importance of the other 3. And look, situation right now is it's evolving at a very fast rate. The Russians are not looking as strong as they did 30 days ago. They're not looking as strong as they did 60 days ago. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean on the battlefield. They're still making gains on the battlefield at immense cost. I mean, just 1,200 to 1,500 casualties a day. But their interest rate is over 20%. Their inflation rate is spiking. They're beginning, Putin is going to face some very hard choices on manpower. They're burning through their stocks of equipment much faster than they can replace it. And as an expert said, look, the sands on the hourglass are running out for both combatants in this war, not just Ukraine. And so if there's this sort of situation or this presumption that says, well, Ukraine needs to, there's no real cost to kind of cutting off aid because Ukraine needs to sue for peace now. Like Ukraine is in a crisis and it needs to sue for peace. That's one whole different strategic consideration. But if the actual reality is, yeah, Ukraine is straining to the limit, but so is Russia.
Yeah.
That changes the analysis quite a bit. And so this is where if, we could have a situation where Ukraine, if it is adequately supported and sustained, could actually achieve a much more favorable peace. But if you, at this very key moment, you remove support from Ukraine, you're going to actually throw Putin a lifeline. You're going to do exactly what he was aiming to do. And that is exhaust the Ukrainian people. After the initial sort of blitzkrieg style offensive failed, exhaust the West, exhaust the Ukrainian people. That's what he's been trying to do. Yeah. And one of the reasons why the big ramp up in the Russian offensive has been so dangerous is it's created the impression in the West that the Ukrainian cause might be lost. When the reality is, this is a big throw of the dice from Putin. Literally, Curtis, 1,200 to 1,500 soldiers a day. He cannot keep that up. He cannot keep up the loss of equipment. So he's rolled the dice with this giant offensive with extraordinary casualties, I think in the hope that it will diminish Ukraine sufficiently to where it will give a Trump administration all the cover it needs to sort of say it's time to pull the plug. When the reality is he's rolled the dice and now is not the time to give him a victory. Now, there's going to be a time for peace talks for sure, but right now, this is not the time to capitulate to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, this seems like, I don't have any insight into intelligence sources, but the timing seems quite obvious to me that Putin is thinking with a Trump victory, if I can, put enough pressure on Ukraine, like you said, that gives the Trump administration a reason, a cover to pull aid. And then what actually ends up happening is, we are, in that old phrase, David, we are going to be snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Yeah.
And that would be just so tragic. It's tragic, not just, I think it's important for us to realize that it's not just tragic for Ukraine. I mean, that is a great tragedy. We're talking about millions of people, millions of innocent people who are trying to just defend their home against unjust aggression. But like you said, I think what you're pointing out is it's going to set a terrible, terrible precedent. To go back to our January 6th discussion, international politics also relies on a sense of what are norms as well. Like you cannot, it especially requires a sense of like, what are the actual basic standards that we're going to hold in our global order. And one of them has got to be that unjust aggression, unjust evasion gets resisted. It does not, you do not win by making that move. And this is a moment in history where we've got to like draw the line and say, no, the West is still going to stand up to this. We're not going to forget all the hard-won lessons of the last 100 years of politics that shows us if you don't stand up to aggression, if you don't stand up to regimes, totalitarian regimes that are seeking to impose their way on other countries, then you're inviting greater and greater disaster. So, David, on this front, it feels like, what we should be paying attention to it. What would be the things that you would say, pay attention to this? Is it aid levels? Is it like, what's the key thing that those of us who care about this?
This is complicated. Well, the easiest part is aid levels. Like that's, if we cut off aid, boy, it is going to be tough. And even with European allies stepping up, because it's not just money. It's, do you have access to American arms? And do you have access to American arms manufactured by the American industrial base? And that's because sadly, the British and French industrial base, defense base, the South Korean defense base, the Japanese defense, like all of the big Western powers, German, none of them are where they need to be. Now, many of them are ramping up. Macron and France has really been trying to, the French army has really been trying to increase readiness, et cetera. But So the aid level is a big one. But here's the thing not enough people are talking about. Most people who follow this conflict closely have given up on the idea that Ukraine can just kick Russia out of Ukrainian territory. That is not the live debate. The live debate is, what else is Ukraine required to give up in addition to freezing the lines where they are? So, as a general matter, what you're looking at is a Korean style settlement. And so where you freeze the conflict on roughly along the existing lines, you might change it a bit because of giving land swaps, whatever. But you freeze it roughly on existing lines. And the reason why that was fine for South Korea is that South Korea was still able to enter into its military alliance with the U.S., maintain its military alliance with the U.S. I mean, it was able to be a free and independent and vibrant democracy, vibrant enough to impeach its very undemocratic president.
Yeah.
But if you say to Ukraine, okay, we're going to freeze our current fight, the current lines, but also you have to declare neutrality, but also you cannot join the EU, but also you cannot join NATO, then what you've said is, okay, we're freezing the lines and Ukraine is becoming a satellite state of Russia. It's essentially becoming another Belarus. That's a lost war. That's a win for Putin. That's a loss for Ukraine, because Ukraine at that point is no longer fundamentally an independent nation.
Yeah.
And so it's what to watch for is the armistice or peace talks, is it freezing the line? It is, what else in addition to freezing the line is Ukraine being forced to agree to?
Yeah, any settlement has got to be underwritten with who's going to guarantee these lines going forward.
Right.
You're right. This Korean settlement worked because American troops are at the DMZ underwriting that as that by an American promise, and that's where this feels dangerous. Is can that happen here? And something we ought to be paying attention to. And it seems to me, David, there's things we can do, of course, if you are in that mode, which I think a very small percentage of people are in this mode of writing letters, communicating to legislators, certainly always actually more influential than people realize, because frankly, so little of that done that you actually have an outsized voice if you actually take the trouble to communicate to your senator or your congressman. But I know that's even a stretch for a lot of folks. David, it seems like this is one where we need to be praying. We need to be praying,
absolutely.
Because these are forces obviously beyond the control of any one of us.
So much, far beyond. Yeah.
Give us some lines of prayer that we ought to be, if you care about this, and I hope you do, we ought to be incorporating into our prayer lives.
I mean, I have a very consistent prayer, because one of the things I don't necessarily like to do is pray for specific policy outcomes, because that would be, I have my definite ideas, but this is an incredibly complex, dangerous, and evolving situation. And so I do not hold myself out as having the God's eye view on the right policy outcome. So I try not to do that. So what I try to do is pray for wisdom and courage. Because there have been moments in my life where I have disagreed with a policy decision, and if I reflect back on it 5 years later, it was correct and I was wrong. So I feel like praying for wisdom and courage, because I feel pretty confident I know what the outcome should be in Ukraine. I feel pretty darn confident about that. But I'm not going to interrupt a prayer for Ukraine to join NATO. Like I'm not going to be like that specific. But wisdom and courage, wisdom to know what is the best policy, the most just policy, the policy that protects the innocent and opposes evil, and the courage to implement it. And, I think that praying in that direction, not just for Ukraine, but in general, is the way to go. And I would just be very reluctant to sort of, make your specific policy prescription one that is the matter of, God's direct intervention.
Yeah. Well, that's a great word to end on, a great word for us as we close out 2024 and enter 2025, that may we all be joining together to pray for wisdom and courage for all involved in all of these issues that we've talked about at all of these levels. Our own wisdom and courage, wisdom and courage of our leaders, the wisdom and courage of those who are being affected on the ground by those issues, whether it is a Ukrainian soldier or civilian or an immigrant who is awaiting asylum here in the U.S. These are issues that we are so big, so beyond us. And this is when we need to remember the true wisdom and courage that we are banking on is not really ultimately of any one person or any one collection of purposes. It is the wisdom and courage of God that we are banking our hopes on. So let's be praying for that because we can bank on that. And David, so thank you for another year of being the founding friend of Good Faith and bringing so much wisdom and courage to our list, to me and to my listeners. I really am going to be also praying that you have a restful few weeks. That
I'm taking
I know
time
that's your
off
goal.
at the end of the year, Curtis.
I'm so proud of you, David.
Yeah,
It's something that I know
you.
It takes some work for you to get to that place. Folks, be praying for David that he actually is able to do this.
Amen.
It's something he needs, his family needs. And David, thank you. And for all of you listeners, I do also pray that your close of the year is filled with rest, with peace, and that we all can join together in the wisdom and courage of God. Join us next week as we once again gather around the campfire.